Hello everybody, sorry for the reflective eyes, but that's what we've got. I'm going to give you a demo. We'll see how long it goes because I'm going to do this cold, showing you how to do the complete example in this web page that I pointed out to you. And for the record, here is the URL. You can look at it. So here we go. So we're going to start by creating a directory called Sinatra Demo, or call it Sinatra 3. Make their Sinatra 3, go into it, and create a file called app.rb, following the example, go into my text editor, and get ready to edit that file. So I'm going to just put in what he's got here. First of all, this is going to be a regular Ruby file, and we have to require the library called Sinatra, which we will bring in as a gem in a second. And we're going to do the very simple root, which is if the server is asked for the root page, it's just going to return hello world. And save this and indicate that it's a Sinatra Ruby file by calling it app.rb. Okay, there we go. And it turns nice and color-coded because it now knows it's Ruby file. I'm going to next create a file called config.ru, which is one of those files that you have to just accept on faith for now. But it's another Ruby file, a Ruby-like file, and I'm going to say require /app and run Sinatra application in that file. And I'll save it and call it config.ru. RU standing for rackup. Okay, fine. Next I'm going to create a gem file, which is a sort of a catalog of the gems that this app requires, and gem files are something you'll see in a lot of different Ruby programs, and they're just the sort of the library manager tool gems are for the Ruby world. And so I'm going to add here source https://rubygems.org quote followed by gem Sinatra. So I'm telling, this is basically a catalog, or what they call a manifest showing the particular gems. In this case, I'm saying I only need one gem off of the gem server, and this is going to be called gem file, as I said. So now we should have 3 files in this directory so far, and we do. Okay, so now I'm going back to the bundle, to the terminal up here. Maybe I'll make this window a little bit, or the font a little bigger, but not the window, because it'll cover things up. And I'll do the same thing here actually. Okay, and I'm going to run bundle install, and that's going to make sure that the particular gem that I need is actually present. And does its thing. All set. By the way, I didn't start by saying let's make sure we have a valid version of Ruby, and for our purposes anything over 2.1 or even 2.0 is fine. And we can also check that we have a valid gem application, and we can check that we have a valid bundle utility. All that's good. Okay, so if those things don't work for you, then you're going to have to go back and figure out your configuration a little bit more. Okay, next we're going to do is set up our database. Okay, so this is going to be a simple database-driven application using Sinatra and using Postgres. So I'm going to proceed here and create the database.yml in the config directory. So I'm going to go here to Sinatra. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it config. And in the config directory, I'm going to add a file called database, yml Now, YML stands for yet another markup language. It's just another syntax to put data in a text file. It's very similar to JSON. In fact, it's hard to tell the difference. They just came from different places. Okay, so I'm going to now add the text that's here. I'm going to just copy it just for the fun of it, make it easier, and I'll interpret for you what we see here. So basically what we see here is that for the when I'm running my server in development mode, I want to use Postgres. I want to use a database called development. I want to get the username and the password from environment variables, and we'll see more about that in a second. And this is going to be running on the local host that is my own computer. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And in addition, I'm going to create within config also another file called environments.rb, and you'll see what that is. Save it as environments.rb, and I'm going to just copy this text over, and then I'm going to explain to you what it contains. Okay. Okay. So I'm calling a configure command. I'm going to indicate that I want to configure both the production and the development environment, and those are just keywords. They just indicate the name of one environment and another environment. And in both cases, upon configuration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the database, either following an environment variable called database URL, and if that environment variable is not present, because it's, in other words, it's nil, then I'm going to just hardwire it to Postgres and with that path. Next, I'm going to activate or initialize the active record subsystem with which we're going to be connecting to the database. And I'm going to indicate that I want to establish the connection, and I want to indicate various parameters about that connection. And that's about it. Okay? So now we're going to go back and make a so-called rake file for this project. I'm going to put that in the root directory, and a rake file is, as you will see, just a very simple mechanism to automatically cause builds to happen and do all kinds of other automatic setup processes and automatic developer activities. And in the rake file is just another Ruby file, so I'm going to require the app itself, and I'm going to require, that is, the C equivalent, the Java, the C equivalent would be include, and I think the Java equivalent would be import. And then we're going to, from the Sinatra subsystem, the Sinatra gem, I'm going to ask for the active record /rake. And for now, that's all there is, and this is called the rake file. So now, if you take a look at our program here, we have a config directory, and we have a rake file, and then we have the app.rb, which is actually the executable, and we'll have the config.ru and gem file, which are the two specification bits. Okay. Now the next thing is, since we've added a few more assumptions in our app, we're going to go and update our gem file to include the relevant additional gems that we need. First of all is gem active record, which is a very popular library coming out of the Rails world to let you access SQL databases. And then we're going to ask for the Sinatra active record library, and that is a library that helps us access active record from within Sinatra in the most convenient way. And then finally, PG stands for Postgres, which is the sort of database driver for Postgres, which is the database system we'll be using. In addition, we'll have to now update our app.rb to include some additional lines of text. That is to say, in addition to the require Sinatra, we have a few more lines, which is to require the active record subsystem, and then /config environments means from where I am, go up to config, and then there you'll find a file called environments.rb, and pull that in as well. So that's what that means. Okay, so we've got everything all set here, so now I'm going to do a bundle install here again. Actually, just bundle by itself is enough. And if the syntax of my gem file is correct, then it will load in not only the gems that I asked for, but a whole bunch of other ones that are subsequently dependent on it as well. Okay, now, so that looks like it worked very nicely, and we're now going to create a new file called the model file for this very simple application. And just for convenient organization, I'm going to create a folder called models, and in that folder I'm going to create a file called what do they want to call it? They're going to call it model.rb. Okay, so the term model is right out of the world of model view controller, and it means kind of the Ruby layer that interfaces with the database. And because you're using Active Record, and don't worry too much about this, you'll learn about it as we go, we put very short abbreviation that says create a new class in Ruby called model, which is derived or a subclass of the Active Record base class, and it actually has nothing in it, oddly enough, and we'll get back to that. Now, since this new file is sitting in the model subdirectory, we go back to the app, RB file, and we add that require on here as well. So I'm going to add mod/models/model. Models is the directory, model is the file. Gotcha? Okay. Now, next thing we have to do is we have to define the schema for the database corresponding to this model called model, which is kind of an inconvenient name, but I'm just following the example. Okay, so for the model called model, we're going to create a new directory called DB. Okay, so we're going to go to Sinatra directory, we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call it DB, and in that folder we will place a file that instructs us how to create the database. Now, creating the database is a separate step because the database is a separate server from our web server, and in here we have to just put the information that we need. For now, our model is going to be super simple. To create the model, or to sort of upgrade it from nothing to something, we have to just create a new table called models, and it's going to have just one field called name. And if we want to reverse that process, and I'll explain later why you might want to reverse that process, to downgrade it, we would just drop that table, and that would revert the database back to what it was like before. So I'll save this, and we'll call it, what do we call it according to this example? Okay, gotcha. Actually, what he wanted us to do, and I'll do that, is don't save it, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to type I'm going to just say rake db. This is actually unnecessary, it's going to do what I did anyway, but db create migration name equals create model, and if all works correctly, then in the database directory there is now a migration file, and it's called just like what I was doing before, create model, but now it's got this magic number which makes it easier to make sure that it doesn't get accidentally overwritten. So I'll put the text of this migration into this file, replacing what's there, and my explanation from before applies. So I'll save it, and now I'll go back to my command line. I'm going to say rake db migrate, which tells, okay, we have an error here, and I'm going to pause the recording while I figure out what the error is. Okay, I'm back. I just went back to figure out how to get the Postgres service working, and I noticed that it's a separate little process, which hopefully you will have already done. But if you haven't, you should pause now and go figure out how to do that, and we can help you with that. But meanwhile, if you have the process correctly set up, then you should be able to do a create db command, which will talk to the Postgres server, or service, because it's running on this computer, and ask it to create a database called mydb. And it looks like it worked. Now I should be able to do the command that I said I was going to do, which is rake db migrate, which will actually follow the instructions here to create a table called models, which has a single column called string in that database called mydb. and it complains because I have to save this file. Try it again. There it is. So now it's done what it was supposed to do, and now we have a table with the right name. Alright, now the table is created, we're going to start adding and viewing records. Okay, we have to add a few more pages to our website, so we're going to need a form to submit a model and a page for viewing all the models, and so on. So first we're going to do is create these pages, which we call views. Okay, that is a term that is used often in the model view controller lingo to mean the user interface of a page or a dialog box or something like that, and we use the same nomenclature within Sinatra. So I'm going to create a new directory called views as follows. And within that directory, I'm going to create a new file called index.erb and models.erb. Start with index.erb. And while we're at it, let's put in there also the models.erb. Okay, now ERB is a file extension we're going to be seeing a lot of, and it stands for Embedded Ruby, and it basically means it's a combined, it's kind of a hybrid of Ruby and HTML together, allowing you to take static HTML tags like you're familiar with and combine it with some dynamic code. And the dynamic code would be written in Ruby. Okay, so let's go first to the index.erb file. I'm going to just copy and paste this just to save myself typing, and then I'm going to explain what it contains. Okay, I'm going to go over here and save it, and basically this is a very simple HTML file with no magic, H3 header, and then a form tag which says that when you click submit, it's going to call the /submit path or URL with the method post, and it's going to submit this information back. Simple as that. Now we're going to go back to our app.rb, which is the driver for this whole world, and instead of saying hello world when we see a slash, we're going to describe, or we're going to emit essentially the HTML for the index.html that we just index.erb that we just created. And when I say emit, you remember that what a web server basically does is, given a URL, it generates some HTML. That's basically the way the whole game is played. Now in this case, the first URL that it would receive is the URL for just the root, i.e., my website / nothing more. In that case, it's going to display the index file, and then it's going to need a second bit of code, which is when the submit button is pressed. And if we refer back to let me just find it here really quick. Delete all these files that are just going to confuse us for now. This is a form, and the form is displayed. And then when the user clicks submit, it's going to go to this path, /submit. And so in our app.rb, we're going to say, when you see /submit, here's what I want you to do. I want you to create a new instance of the model, of the class called model, and I'm going to supply it the name of the model, and then I'm going to try to save it, and if it works, I'm going to go to models. If not, it's going to fail. That's it. Very, very simple. Okay, so the home page of your app will now render the ERB template called index. Sinatra assumed the file extension is .erb, and we have a new root at /submit. This new root only accepts post requests. In other words, if you send something to /submit that's a get, it's not going to accept it, and it's going to try to save the file. It's a very simple ERB template. Okay? All right. The final step in this process is, notice over here, we redirect to yet a new path, /models, and so we have to say what happens in that case. So I'm going to copy that from here, and I'm going to put a comment in here just to drive the point home. This web server accepts exactly 3 URLs. server.com/ which displays a form. I never copied this over, sorry. I just talked about it, but didn't do it. I'm going to do it now. Where the user can add a record. It's going to have server.com, which is fake, of course. That'd be called example.com, just to make it more clear. Example.com/submit with a post where the form contents is accepted and a new record is created. It's accepted and a new record is created. And finally, example.com/models that is going to where the list of models is displayed. And this obviously is still example.com because we're faking it. Okay? Fine. And so ERB models, obviously that's referring to a new view, so we're going to have to create a new file in the models, in the views directory, where we actually see that we created it before. So let me read here. The models root collects all the models in the database into the @models instance. And that's because it says model.all, which is a active record way to say all records in the model. It'll run the SQL to select all the models from your database and return the result in the @models variable as a list of objects, each one with the name field that we can access in the template. So now the app is completely functional. The last step is to deploy to Heroku. Now, actually, before we're going to deploy to Heroku, we're going to try to just run it locally. Actually, he does not actually show how to do it, but I'm going to run it locally first to show you that it works. Let me just inspect it to make sure it's all correct, and it is. So I'm not going to send it to Heroku, but instead I'm going to run it. So let me just quickly pause this and check something. Okay, so as I was saying, we just finished making this file. We have the whole this directory with all the bits, and all I have to do now is to run it as if it was a Ruby program. So I'm going to say ruby app.rb and see what happens. And basically what's going to happen is, right at this point, Sinatra is going to launch a server, a web server locally, and you can notice here that the web server is running on port 4567 on this computer, and it's waiting for those URLs that we talked about. So let's type in a URL, 0.0, this means localhost 4567, and there it is, welcome to Sinatra, which is exactly what we said over here, right? There it says welcome to Sinatra. I have not even tried this. I'm going to try this. Hello Brandeis, and we're going to debug it together if it doesn't work. Okay, so here's what happened. So it went to apparently to models, and it said, I don't know what the path models means. So let's go look at our app.rb and see what might be wrong. Oh, well, I didn't put that last bit of it here. So we have to go back here and just copy this over. I'm going to teach it what models means, save it. I do have to stop the server and restart it. And now it's all running, and I should be able to refresh this page and see nothing came out. Why did nothing come out? But let's go look at our, so let's see what happened. This worked, get /models do, so it found it because it's not giving an error. Here's the /models. It's asked the model to create a list of all the model records, and then it did ERB models. So it's going to look for a file called models.erb in the views directory. So let's look here. I didn't put anything in there. This was not planned. Let's go back and steal the code to save me the typing, and I will explain to you what it is, and then I'm going to do one final tour of it to explain everything again. I'm going to save models.erb, and now I think I have to restart the server. Let's just see if that's true. Nope, I don't. There's the first hello Brandeis. I'm going to add another one. I'm going to say goodbye Boston, submit. Now I have two records. Just to prove that that's true, I'm going to say, you know, instead of H3, I'm going to make this an H2. All my models, save it, refresh, there it is. It's bigger, and it says all my models. Clearly, each of these bullets, because they're LIs, correspond to the name of the model. So we have a basic, very, very basic web server that we built in a few minutes. Let me now review with you everything that I've done, okay? So essentially, Sinatra lets me use simple Ruby code to write the code to drive a web server. And if you look at it, this is really all that we have so far. Now, if you remember from what we've learned before, a web server, in the most simplistic way of looking at it, receives a URL and returns a page of HTML. So one of the very important jobs of a web server is to first figure out what the meaning is of the URL. In other words, to parse the URL. In other words, we say to route the request. And we have to decide ahead of time what the requests are that we want to be able to route. It's very interesting, I think, that we have here a problem with, I think I have two copies of the same file open. Let's see if that's true. Oh, okay. Yes, I do. Here's another app.rb, which did have the right code in it. So let me just do this, figure out what the heck is going on here. Go back here. Okay, whatever. I don't know exactly what's going on, but here's the file. I think I might have had two copies of it open. So app.rb reflects all the logic that this particular server understands. And basically it understands three URLs: slash submit, and slash models. That's all it understands. Very simple, right? Slash is going to just accept the name of a take a text string. Slash submit is accepts the content of a form and sticks it into a record. And finally, slash models shows me the list of all the records. I'm just neatening this up as I talk because I'm going to put this into GitHub as well. Okay, so that's the basic logic. Now let's take another level. So we're talking here first of all about the views. So what a view is basically a page that gets displayed in a web browser. That's the most simplistic way of putting it. And it's basically the answer that comes back from one of these URLs. So there's three URLs, or three routes. The first one has this special magic that says ERB:index. That says two things. Number one, look in a file called index.erb in the views directory. And number two, make sure it has an ERB extension. And number three, emit it as HTML. So that's the result. Very, very simple. Secondly, on this one, the second one, find a route called submit. Make sure that it was sent with an HTTP post, and then do the following steps. Now we're going to get into a little bit of active record and working with the database for the first time. So we look first at the models at the index.erb, and we notice that it was a form, very simple form that has only one field, and the field is labeled, as we can see here as we run it. The field is not labeled at all. It simply says enter model name, which is the prompt. And when you enter the model name and press the submit button, it's going to do a post, because it says post here, to the /submit path. And what happens there? Well, let's look at app.rb. First of all, it pulls out of the form whatever was the field called :model, and it creates, and it asks active record, i.e. the model, bad choice of name, to create a new record with that as the parameter. Now if we go look at model.rb, as I told you before, there's hardly anything in it. That's because a lot of the behavior we get out of active record is automatic, and that includes the ability to do a create. So looking at app.rb again, the ability to do a model.new with a parameter is going to create a model with just that one value, and it's going to return the object ID of that model instance into @model. It's going to attempt to save it, and if that save works, it's going to go right to /models. If it fails, it's going to give an error. That's what the /submit does. Finally, redirecting to /models, that's here, is going to use active record again. It's going to use a different clause in active record called the all clause, which says give me all the records in model, and it's going to put them all in an instance variable called @models, and then it's going to look for another view called called models, and it's going to execute ERB on that. If we look at models.erb, we see that it's straightforward HTML, H2, a list, and then comes something interesting. Now you see why it's called ERB, because within angle percent angle, you can find actual Ruby code, which gets executed as part of the generation of this ERB. So basically, if you look from this line to this line, we're running a loop, and for every loop, for every instance in this variable called @models, it's executing an li, it's rather emitting an li, which is a list item in HTML, followed by the model name, and that's how we end up with this. So now you should have 3 of them. Okay? And then finally, it has an an anchor, there's a link that says go back to the root and says back to home, which is this. Okay, so that's the core of it. And then a couple of the supporting files that we generated were database.yml, which simply said that we were using Postgres for the development environment. That's all we're using for now. We were not supplying a username and password because it's local, so it doesn't matter. And that's it. And then over here, this basically is code that would cause the database to be opened at the beginning, at the launching of the Sinatra server. And this is just standard code. Most important part of it is that the default URL for the database is mydb, which is why before I had to do a create database mydb. Okay, and then this boilerplate, I wouldn't worry about that yet. And then we had the migration file, which was instructions to actually add the records to the database, add the columns to the database and create the database tables. We had the rake file, which is essentially boilerplate. You can just copy this. This just pulls in key rake tasks, that is, different programmer tasks. Rake are commands that the developer uses from the shell prompt to do developer required activities like running a migration or things like that. Okay, that's basically it. I know there's a lot of new stuff here, but between the written tutorial here, which I followed literally up until almost the very end, and my screencast and your own reading, you should all be able to get this to work. Okay, thank you very much, and see you next time.